In this concluding portion of the lecture on the fighting of the Peloponnesian War, we're going to first survey its last years to the Athenians' final defeat at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BC. And then we will consider the peace terms that Sparta imposed on Athens, which included a pro-Spartan oligarchy. Then finally, as something of an epilogue, we will discuss the restoration of democracy in 403 BC. And since we're going to be looking at Athens in a fair amount of detail after the mid-4th century, it makes sense for me to sort of bring in the restoration of democracy at the end of this lecture, since Athens would return to a radical democracy. Incidentally, Thucydides ends his account of the war with the end of the oligarchy of 411 that we discussed in the prior portion. So we can actually say farewell to Thucydides here. We have no idea whether Thucydides meant to finish his history here. That's a whole big subject of debate. So we can we have no idea about that, and or whether he intended to write a full account of events down to the year 404 and never got around to doing so. For events after 411 BC, we have to use another writer, that is Xenophon's work, the Hellenica, and this work picks up directly where Thucydides leaves off, and it covers Greek history down to the year 362. And in fact, it quite literally picks up where Thucydides leaves off, because the opening words of Xenophon's Hellenica are metadetauta, after these things. So it is literally a continuum. Athens may have regained its naval ascendancy in the Aegean, but Sparta too had made gains in this period. And we mustn't forget Sparta's alliance with Persia, and hence the specter of Persian involvement in Greek affairs yet again. Tissaphernes, the previous satrap of Sardis, who had intrigued with Alcibiades despite the alliance with Sparta, had been replaced by the great king of Persia's own son, Cyrus. And Cyrus is very keen to prove himself by getting involved in the Peloponnesian War on the side of Sparta. Moreover, this is the period when the Spartans made Lysander their admiral. Like Gylippus in the Sicilian expedition, Lysander was one of the Mothakes, but unlike Gylippus, Lysander seems to have endeared himself especially to the Spartan king Agis. Lysander seems to have had some kind of romantic relationship with Aegis's brother, perhaps half-brother, and presumably that relationship helped him to kind of get into the good graces of Aegis himself. So in 407 BC, Alcibiades finally thought it was safe to return to Athens. Remember how he had turned the tables so neatly on the Spartans at sea? Well, virtually the whole of the city of Athens turned out to meet him when he arrived, like a hero's welcome, though it was an uncomfortable return in some ways. And actually, when he disembarked, he made sure he was surrounded by a couple of bodyguards. For the first few years or so, Alcibiades had been re-elected strategos. He had performed magnificently for the Athenians. Now he was given full powers for the conduct of the war. Unfortunately, he wouldn't be around very long, though, to use them, as we'll see. In 406 BC, the Spartan admiral Lysander defeated an Athenian fleet at the Battle of Notion, in the process sinking 20 vessels. This shock was so great for the Athenians that even though Alcibiades wasn't present at the Battle of Notion, he was held responsible for the defeat. And so Alcibiades fled yet again, this time to a fortified area he had built along the Hellespont region, and he never returned to Athens. The assembly's change of heart towards Alcibiades reflected yet once again that his enemies were not prepared to let him be. And at the same time, it also reflected the ease by which orators continued to manipulate the people. Alcibiades deserves some blame, I think, for the defeat. He had left a man named Antiochus, his pilot, in charge of the Athenian fleet at Notion, rather than staying with it himself. Although Alcibiades had told Antiochus he was not to do battle with Lysander, evidently Antiochus ignored him. So on the one hand, Alcibiades shouldn't be condemned for the defeat because he wasn't even there. But on the other hand, he shouldn't have left Antiochus in charge, especially as Antiochus probably lacked experience of command anyway. He was just a pilot after all. Even so, to remove the one person who had any chance of success in winning the war for the Athenians was still further stupidity on the Athenians' part. They obviously had not learned anything from the Sicilian disaster. Remember, I said then at an earlier point in our lecture tonight, that I had a gut feeling that if Alcibiades had been left alone, he could have pulled off victory in Sicily, and I do stick by that, etc. Well, the Spartans followed up their victory at Notion by besieging Mytilene. Um, uh, in Athens, there was panic, and the people resolved to melt down the gold and silver statues on the Acropolis for bullion with which to buy and then equip a new fleet. They also promised the metics, these were the resident aliens who lived and worked in Athens, citizenship. Even more radically, they promised freedom to the slaves if they would row in this new fleet. Within a month, Athens and its allies had a fleet of 150 ships together, and these sailed off under the command of Conon to relieve Mytilene. Conon and a force went on to Mytilene, while the remainder of the Athenian fleet engaged the Peloponnesian fleet south of Lesbos at a place called Arginusae. You can see it right there on the map. Now, in a major naval battle there, Athens was victorious, and in that battle, the Athenians sank no less than 75 Peloponnesian vessels. Among those killed in the Battle of Arginusae was the Spartan admiral Callicratidas. He had succeeded Lysander because in Sparta, the office of admiral or navarch was an annual one. And this was a big difference, right, between military commands in Sparta and Athens. As we know, in Athens, re-election was possible any number of times, and that allowed a continuation of policy. Well, Arginusae was a battle that the Athenians had to win. They simply had to win it in order to have any edge over the Spartans in this war. It is no stretch of the imagination to say that the Athenians must have been euphoric over this victory. But then the tide turned. Conon was still fighting against odds at Mytilene, but there were a number of Athenian crew members in the water at Arginusae who needed rescuing. As their ship sank, they jumped into the water with the expectation that other vessels in the fleet would turn back to get them. However, it seems that the Athenian commanders at Arginusae were split on the issue of rescuing these drowning comrades and going to the aid of Conon. And such dilly-dallying among the Athenian commanders cost precious time. And a further storm blew up, and this storm prevented the men in the water from being rescued. As a result, they drowned. This, of course, was a terrible thing to happen, but whether the weather got too bad, the generals at Arginusae made the decision not to help the drowning men because of the potential danger to the ships that tried to rescue them. So this was kind of a needs of the many over the needs of the few decision. The belief was, of course, that if a majority of Athenian vessels sailed back into the straits to rescue the drowning men, then the storm could wreak havoc on those vessels, as well as cost the Athenians even more lives. Well, in Athens, the people all of a sudden found the general's actions at Arginusae unacceptable, and recriminations followed. Everyone blamed everyone else. The 8 generals, remember there were 10 generals elected every year, 8 of them happened to be serving in this fleet at Arginusae. Those 8 generals present at the battle were ordered back to Athens to be put on trial before the assembly for negligence. And when this happened, they were found guilty and summarily executed. Their property was confiscated by the state. In actual fact, only 6 of the generals made it back because 2 saw the writing on the wall and prudently stayed where they were. To us, the Athenian Assembly's trial of these Arginusae generals was a ridiculous course of action. And actually, if you've ever read Socrates' defense speech, you'll know that he was actually one of the jury members, and he tried to speak in defense of these men, and he was shouted down at the trial. It was a ridiculous course of action because these men had masterminded the victory at Arginusae, but the verdict against them was dictated by the hysterical mood of the people, and that is a theme that comes up again and again in the narrative of these events in the Peloponnesian War, that a direct democracy really cannot prosecute a war successfully. People's emotions just sway the mob, in all sorts of unproductive directions. At the same time, we can sort of understand the Athenians' reasoning because the sailors who drowned were not recovered. If you know anything about Greek mythology, you'll know that if a person is not buried, then their soul never enters into the underworld. It just roams around. And so the general's orders not to go back to try to rescue these drowning crews this element as well. Well, in any event, after Arginusae, the Spartans sued for peace. Though the Spartans were not proposing anything radically different from the last time they wanted peace, they did promise to vacate Decelea. And remember, this was the Spartan enclave on Attic soil. And this to vacate Decelea would have meant that the enemy outpost in Attica would no longer be there. This was the time in Athens to accept the Spartans' plea for peace, because the Athenians had no financial reserves left. They had nothing else to melt down to turn into coins, and they'd only managed to cobble together the fleet that they had sailed to Arginusae by the skin of their teeth. The Spartan move now then was a godsend to them, and all the more so given that the Athenians had just executed 6 of their 10 strategoi. However, the demagogue who was running the assembly at this time was Cleophon, and he persuaded the people once more to reject the Spartan appeal. Athenians turned the Spartans down. Like last time, Cleon was after the total defeat of the Spartans, because only by a total defeat could the Athenians impose terms on them. The last thing they wanted was a sort of return to the status quo, where eventually the Spartans might go to war against Athens again. Cleophon was all out for terms then, but his decision now to block the Spartan peace proposals was a major blunder. He had been right, in my opinion, to reject Sparta before, as we talked about. But the situation in 406 now was very different. His advice in 406 allowed Sparta to rebuild its fleet, and with Persian aid sent to it by Cyrus, and then Lysander now was given command of the Spartan fleet. And since both sides, both Athens and Sparta, could not keep on fighting, the war was evidently going to be decided quite soon. And literally by one last battle. And that last battle would be the Battle of Aegospotami. Okay. And as I like to call it, is the battle that never was. I'm sorry for the fuzziness of this slide. Spotami is this region up in here. The Spartans had switched the theater of war, you see, from the mainland to the Hellespont now. And this was a good strategy on their part, because the Spartans knew this was a critical area for the Athenians on the grain route from the Black Sea. They knew that the Athenians would have to respond to any hostile interference in this vitally important region for them. And that is why, in the summer of 405 BC, Lysander of Sparta, at the head of a fleet of some 200 vessels, attacked the city of Lampsacus in the Hellespont. He attacked it by land and by sea, and he successfully seized Lampsacus. That gave Sparta a significant presence on the shores of the Propontis, that is the modern Sea of Marmara, up there by the, this is the Sea of Marmara, the Propontis. And the Athenians immediately sent a fleet of about 180 ships and about 36,000 men or so to counter Sparta's moves in this area. They had no choice. Their fleet had no, but nevertheless, their fleet had no single commander. It was in the hands of 6 strategoi. So this sharing of command was similar to the fleet that had sailed to Arginusae in 406. The Athenian fleet took up a position about 10 miles or so into the Hellespont at a place called Aegospotami. And Aegospotami is about 2 or 3 miles or so across the straits from Lampsacus. Apparently, Alcibiades, who by now was living in voluntary exile in his fortress up in the Hellespont, apparently he made a quick trip to the Athenian fleet to tell the commanders to move it elsewhere. As Alcibiades rightly saw, Aegospotami was not the best place to station a fleet of this size. For one thing, there was no harbor there, only a beach. That meant that the heavy triremes would have to be pulled onto the beach when they weren't in use and then pushed back into the water to be launched. In the meantime, the crews scrambling to get on them, that would take time. A fleet riding at anchor could be deployed far more quickly, of course. The other thing that Alcibiades saw was that there were no adequate supplies in the area of Aegospotami to feed the Athenian forces. The Athenians had a base further down the Hellespont at Sestos on the left bank, which from the provisions point of view would have been the place to station a fleet. Perhaps the reason why Conon, one of the Athenian generals, stayed at Aegospotami was because of the need to stop Lysander sailing through the Propontis and into the Black Sea area, where he would completely disrupt the grain that Athens needed. Well, for 4 days, the Athenians sailed out into the straits trying to lure the Spartans to battle, but Lysander refused to move. Lysander's strategy was twofold. First, to make the Athenians wonder what he was up to, and second, it was to make the Athenians sloppy. It did the trick. On day one, the Athenian fleet rowed out, but nothing happened. They rowed back to shore. On the second day, the same thing happened. The same thing happened on the third day. And by now, the Athenians were probably kind of, thumbing their noses and shouting insults at the Spartans. But Lysander refused to move. Well, again on day 4, the Athenians did the same thing, and Lysander refused to move again. By now, of course, the Athenians were thinking that Lysander might even be intimidated by the size of their fleet, that he might be staying in Lampsacus, hoping the Athenians would simply sail off, go home, and leave him alone. And so the Athenians did get sloppy. The ruse worked. They went out to look for provisions without setting up proper guards over their camp. And sometimes they didn't even beach the triremes properly. And so that's why day 5 would be different. The Athenian fleet, as I mentioned, was commanded by 6 strategoi. One was in command each day, kind of like a commander-in-chief. Well, on the 5th day, the strategos in charge was a fellow named Philocles. He devised a plan to coax Lysander out. He was finally sick of this sort of sailing out and the Spartans doing nothing. Philocles took 30 ships and made for Sestos, it being that Lysander would think that the Athenian armada was finally leaving, and so he would go after Philocles' little fleet and see if he could capture it. Whilst Lysander was doing this, the plan was for the rest of the Athenians to bear down on Lysander's fleet from behind, and so they would take him by surprise. The plan was a good one, but it depended on 2 things. It depended, first of all, on Lysander being fooled in this way, which is a big if, and secondly, it depended on the Athenians getting their acts together in time, which is an even bigger if. In other words, launching their vessels quickly and getting on board quickly before Lysander knew what was going on. Well, unfortunately, neither of these 2 hoaxes worked. They didn't work on somebody like Lysander. He was good. He had been waiting for the Athenians to make a move for a week, and he knew straightway that Philocles' vessels, he knew what they were up to. Philocles sailed down the straits. Lysander immediately gave orders for his fleet to sail, and it moved so quickly that it got around Philocles' ships and attacked them from the front. This was the reverse of what Philocles had expected to happen. That meant the Philocles had no option now but to turn around and to return to the Athenians with the Spartans fast, dogging him from behind. The Athenians back in the main camp had been far too sluggish in getting to their ships and getting them into the water. The result was all they could do was watch in horror. Philocles tore back towards them, but with Lysander and the fleet behind Philocles, bearing down on the entire Athenian fleet that hadn't got its act together and was actually in the water. Was not actually in the water. The Athenians managed to get some of their ships in the water, but to no avail. Ultimately, the majority of the Athenians present in camp panicked and ran away as fast as they could towards Sestos. Meantime, Lysander landed easily at Aegospotami and secured both it and the Athenian fleet. About 10 Athenian ships managed to escape. The remaining 160 were captured, as were about 2,000 or perhaps as many as 3,000 Athenians that hadn't fled in time. They were all summarily put to death. Conon, by the way, managed to escape and flee to Cyprus, of all places, and we were going to meet him again fairly soon. So now you can kind of see why I call Aegospotami the battle that never was, because there was no real fighting. Lysander was victorious without really having to throw a single punch. In one blow, then, the sea power of Athens was annihilated. There was nothing to fall back on. No more statues to melt down, no rich allies, as I said before. So the Athenians had lost the Peloponnesian War. Their empire would soon be no more. The worst aspect of imperialism had now come home to roost. Now, Lysander did not intend to attack Athens itself, but rather he wanted to starve it into surrender. His control of Lampsacus and now Aegospotami meant that he could block the grain that the Athenians needed from the area, and he proceeded to do that. This entailed him installing garrisons in Byzantium and Chalcedon on either side of the Bosporus, and ordering that if anyone were caught trying to smuggle grain to Athens, that person was to be executed. Satisfied with these arrangements in the Hellespont region, Lysander then sailed to Athens to blockade the Piraeus. And that meant that no supplies could get in and nobody could get out. Meantime, Spartan king Agis, who was at Decelea, marched on Athens, which was preparing for a siege. At the same time as Agis marched from Decelea, the other Spartan king, Pausanias, invaded Attica and joined his fellow king in besieging Athens. It's unusual to find both kings of Sparta out and about in this same manner, and evidently the intention was to starve the Athenians into surrender as soon as possible, and so impose terror. Eventually, when the siege grew protracted over the winter, Pausanias and his troops did go back to Sparta. But as more and more Athenians died from famine, it was only a matter of time before the city capitulated, and it did, and the war formally came to an end in April of 404 BC. In Sparta, an assembly of the Peloponnesian allies was held to decide the Athenians' punishment. Some allies, such as Thebes and Corinth, demanded the total destruction of Athens, the killing of all male citizens, and the enslaving of the women and children. The Spartans took a different view, and the Spartans were able to persuade their allies to spare Athens and its people. As justification, they said that because of the role that Athens had played in defeating Xerxes and the Persians in the wars of 480 to 479, the Athenians would not be destroyed in such a way. This reason, of course, was just a pretext. The Spartans didn't give a hoot about the Athenians, but they were concerned that if Athens were wiped off the face of the map, then another power like Thebes, which by now had come to control something of a Boeotian League, would take advantage of that vacuum of power and try to assert their own influence in central Greek politics. And that was, of course, a very perceptive insight. Eventually, the Spartans saw that this would cause a problem for them, so they probably felt it was better to keep Athens intact as a kind of counterbalance, useful barrier, if you like, against a place like Thebes. Nevertheless, harsh terms were imposed on the Athenians. They had to destroy their long walls and the Piraeus fortification. They were also told to dismantle the Delian League. They were allowed to keep only 12 ships, and they became allies of Sparta, acknowledging Sparta's hegemony over them. So the Athenian Empire, this Delian League, came to an end. Whether it was this tyranny, as Cleon described it or not, is inconsequential. And that is why, as Xenophon tells us, the long walls were demolished while flutes played. People thought that this was the first day of the start of the eleutheria of the Greeks, the freedom of the Greeks. If all these terms weren't bad enough, the worst, the Spartans installed a pro-Spartan oligarchy on the city. This oligarchy was called the Rule of the 30, or simply the 30, the Thriakonta. This was led by the extremist Critias, a relative of Plato and a student of Socrates. He appears actually in multiple dialogues of Plato. He had been exiled when the rule of the 400 had come to an end in 411. Critias had been one of their number. Now he was back, and he intended to make up for his previous treatment. The Athenian constitution tells us that the oligarchs wanted to stamp out blackmailers and sycophants, whom they considered corrupt. But then they changed. These oligarchs abolished the courts and the boule. They protected themselves with an armed bodyguard called the whip bearers. The name speaks for itself. And they even asked for 700 additional troops from Lysander to help them rule. Okay, kind of like the situation we have in Washington right now, where we have 10,000 troops protecting our politicians from us. The 30 came to exercise power in a far more bloody way than the oligarchy of 411 BC. Their regime was characterized by the exiling and murdering of opponents, citizens, and medics for personal reasons. According to the Athenian constitution, some 1,500 citizens were put to death, including Cleophon himself. Thousands of Athenian Democrats fled into exile, obviously terrified. The rule of the 30 lasted from September 404 to January 403 BC. And at that time, an Athenian named Thrasybulus and a group of exiled Democrats returned to Athens and brought the 30 to battle. They defeated them, and Critias himself was killed in the battle. Athens was still not free from tyranny because the Romanian tyrants expected Lysander to march back into Attica and support them. That was not to be. Lysander, interestingly enough, Lysander had come to be viewed very suspiciously by the Spartan government. The Spartans might have even been taking into account the attitude of allies like Thebes and Megara, because these two places were appalled by the atrocities committed by the 30, and they actually offered refuge to any Athenian exiles, even though Thebes and Megara had been enemies of Athens, and they were allies of Sparta. In the end, the Spartan king Pausanias did march to Athens. There he brokered a deal between the people, those that had stayed in Athens to support the 30 and the exiled Democrats. This deal was that both sides agreed to reconcile their differences. Again, this would be homonoia. Only the remnants of the actual 30 and their senior aides were to be put to death and put on trial and then executed if found guilty, which they were. By September 403, Thrasybulus and the Democrats were back in Athens. Move to restore Athenian democracy had begun. And so the tale ends, my friends. The tale of the Peloponnesian War and its aftermath were a very inglorious period in Athenian history. The entire war is a sad and inglorious period in Greek history, given the thousands of people that died in it, the massive blow it dealt to the economies of so many states, the devastation to farms all over the place, regardless of whatever they grew. Thucydides was right to see this war as like no other before it. He wrote about it as a warning of the dangers of imperialism and the downsides of direct democracy, so that future generations might never make the same mistake again. Of course, to know. Given the resources of Athens compared to Sparta at the start of the Peloponnesian War in 431, all bets would have to have been on Athens as the city that would win. Yet Athens lost. How and why Athens lost and what happened in Greek history after the Peloponnesian War, though, subject for our lecture next time. Thank you very much.